story of Oregon women's suffrage, which is an impossible task for sure. So what I'd like to do is give you a brief overview. There have been some handouts that have been going around, and those are going to be something you want to take a look at later, but also at the end of the presentation today. Also, I want to give you some resources because after tonight, you're going to be a dedicated suffrage supporter. You're going to want to learn as much as you can, and so we'll have some great resources for you on that. Oregon's campaign for the vote was some 40 years long. That's a long time. Some of us have been alive that long. And it's also the case that I think sometimes we think of the moment that suffrage was won, that votes for women was won in Oregon. I think it's very important to see this as part of a much broader story in the history of women, in the history of Oregon, in the history of the quest for equal rights across the globe. Oregon has the distinction of placing the question of votes for women on the ballot 6 times, more than any other state. We finally got it right in 1912, and I want to talk a little bit about that process and why 1912 was successful. I also think it's important to see that the vote, or suffrage, is a particular part of a much broader story of the quest for full citizenship, the rights of citizenship, the right to vote, the right to engage in office holding, jury service, and other kinds of participation, the obligations of citizenship as well. And this is a story that is ongoing today. It's not concluded. And in fact, what I'm going to ask you to do is to leave tonight committed to take action yourselves to make our communities better and to help us gain more of the history of suffrage in our state. As you know, state-by-state suffrage was a feature of the suffrage movement from the Seneca Falls Convention. You heard we're celebrating that anniversary, July 20th, 1848. The 19th Amendment that brought federal suffrage was ratified in August of 1920. And Oregon's story is a part of that broader story. Another way to picture this, and an editorial cartoonist did that, was to say, the West rules, right? Here's Columbia. She's got it all. She's got the light of freedom and enlightenment, and the West is leading the way to those masses and elites. And so, the story of Oregon, the West, and suffrage is very important. Also, by the time of the turn of the century, the United States was in a mode of reform that we often call the progressive era. And I think this illustration, this editorial cartoon called The Next Rung, really exemplifies that. Here is a woman who is striving to get out of greed and ignorance. Those horrible demons of injustice and prejudice are trying to get her on her quest to true democracy and progress. And suffrage supporters believed that with the vote, they could make a difference in their communities, that they could take action to bring about change. I'd like you to think about the suffrage story in Oregon in 3 pieces. The first part, early organization and legislative attempts up to about 1900, and then the progressive era, steps to victory. That's going to include some important parts of Oregon history with the initiative system that allows people to get that on the ballot. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And I want you to see that, again, one of the distinctive parts of our story is that this goes on the ballot 6 times. And you'll see that it's kind of going up and down from 28% to 48%. And the final victory was just 52%. We'll talk more about how counties voted in just a little bit. If we had more time, we'd talk about how Oregon was a vital part of that final national suffrage movement. We'll do that on another evening. We don't have time to do that tonight. We've got more singing to do. In this first period, women's right to vote. There were specific prohibitions against African Americans, Chinese Americans, and those of mixed heritage who were called mulattoes in the language of the statute. So I want us to remember that women's suffrage was tied to questions of not only gender, but race and ethnicity from the very beginning. If we think about this early period, it's important to take a look at the first steps in voting. And I see that I made my very first mistake, which there will be about 12 more. Sorry about that. The date on this is actually November 6, 1873. After the Civil War, that wrenching time in U.S. history, there were some very important amendments to the Constitution. The 14th, guaranteeing the rights of citizens, and the 15th, supporting voting rights, particularly for African American men. And in 1872, there was a presidential election. Susan Anthony and other suffragists around the nation said, great, we're citizens. The 14th Amendment says if you're born or naturalized, you're a citizen. We're on our way to the polls, and we're going to vote. And they did. Oregon women did this as well. The women that we know about so far are four. Suffrage activist Abigail Scott Duniway, who you've probably heard about, and three other women that you might not have. Maria Hendy, Mrs. M.A. Lambert, and Mary Beatty, who was an African-American seamstress and a Portland activist. They attempted to vote in November of 1872. The election judge accepted their ballots. He was a little flustered. He didn't quite know what to do. And he decided to put them under the ballot box and not inside. So he kind of tucked those in. Even though these votes were not counted, they were the first 4 votes from women in Oregon. And I think it's a very important action. And thank you for forgiving my mistake. It's also the case that there was some conflict between and among women in groups in the suffrage campaign. And so, in October of 1912, Esther Lovejoy decided that she was going to form an organization to really challenge all of that. She called it Everybody's Equal Suffragist League. And it was really a protest against those conflicts, but also a challenge to the dollar-a-month dues that some organizations were paying, because it costs a lot to run an organization, as we know. And also she wanted to support wage-earning women who might not be able to pay those dues. You could get a life membership in Everybody's Equal Suffrage Association for 25 cents, a one-time deal, and everybody was automatically a vice president for life. And I think that really symbolizes the goal here of coalition building. There were over 600 members in just a short month before the vote was taken.